acknowledge that TPFF is hosted on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee. This territory is within lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and we are grateful to be organizing, protesting, and raising our collective voices for Palestine and Lebanon on this land. For decades, and most intensely this past year, we have been horrified by the atrocities coming out of Palestine and Lebanon. We are united in grief, we're united in solidarity, and our freedoms are united. We must stand strong together for the people of Palestine and Lebanon. After this panel, in the same space, we will be hosting a vigil, both to mark the 1 year of genocide in Gaza, but as well as to acknowledge what is happening in the rest of Palestine and in Lebanon. So if you're able to stick around, please join us for that vigil. Our closing night screening is sold out, but if you're here anyways, you can hover around the table and see if any extra tickets are lying around. For those who haven't seen much of our programming so far this year, the festival's program is dedicated to Gaza, and we have been bringing in films, art, discussions around Gaza. So if you haven't had a chance to see the art exhibit when you walked in, right behind the wall, we have the works of Malak Matar and Ibrahim Abu Sitta. Malak is from Gaza, and it was quite the feat to bring both herself and that 5-meter-long mural into Canada. Yeah, in terms of highlights, we still have a little bit of merchandise left in the TIFF shop, but if you can't find your size or can't find your selection, it is all available online on our website. And yeah, the online films, because there's been a lot of films, are available for screening until the clock strikes midnight on October 2nd, and then we're done. So yes, and I wanted to acknowledge again that this panel is co-presented by or with the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association. If you haven't been on our website, canarablaw.org, on that website you will find resources, including the foundational framework on anti-Palestinian racism, as well as an employee right guide for how do you manage protesting or supporting Palestine and navigating the workplace. So we have those resources there, as well with other resources, if you are experiencing anti-Palestinian racism in your spaces. And without further ado, I would like to pass it off to our wonderful moderator, Leila, who will take us through today.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Leila Purdavav. I'm a historian of the modern Middle East and an assistant professor in the history department at York University. I'm also a member of the International Middle East Studies Association's Committee on Academic Freedom, a group which addresses cases of breaches in academic freedom on issues related to the Middle East. Our committee investigates these cases and, when deemed necessary, makes interventions at the administrative, government, and diplomatic levels of the institution and country where the violations take place. As you can imagine, it's been an incredibly busy year for us, as the number of cases of breaches in academic freedom in regards to critiques of the Israeli state and Zionism has been unprecedented. Just to give you an example, this week alone we're dealing with 4 cases in North America. I'll be moderating the panel today titled Suppression of Palestinian Expression, and hopefully bring some of my experiences and learnings from my work with the committee to today's conversation. But first, I want to start by thanking Dania Majid and the TPFF volunteer crew for organizing this panel and this year's much-needed festival. I think I speak for many of us when I say that it's been such a cathartic retreat from the brutality of the news cycle over the last few days, as Israel has escalated what now feels like a genocidal war on Lebanon, while continuing to brutalize Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank. In the context of this multi-pronged, relentless, and unending genocide that has increasingly become numbing, TPFF once again shows us Palestinian life, struggle, and resilience, things that continue to inspire awe and show us all a guiding light as we navigate these darkest of times. I also want to acknowledge that Dania and TPFF have been doing this for nearly 2 decades. It's the 17th year this year. Over that time, the Palestinian struggle has gone through wave after wave after wave of war, devastation, and now full-scale genocide. But like the Palestinian struggle, TPFS has remained steadfast as a space where we can come together and learn, form community, and grow. For me, TPFF is such an important cultural, community, and pedagogical space that has taught me about so many aspects and corners of Palestinian life, geography, history, and humanity. It has literally made the map of Palestine come to life over and over and over again, and in every corner with every story. But also TPFS has always been bigger than just the Palestinian struggle. Over the years, it has always connected to and shown solidarity with other struggles, with Indigenous rights here in Toronto and Turtle Island, with the Arab Spring, with BLM, with the Women Life Freedom Movement in Iran, with LGBTQ rights. The TPFF crew has always made the festival, and through it, the Palestinian struggle connects to larger local and global concerns. And in doing so, made the Palestinian struggle all of our collective fight. And in return, so many of us have made a lifelong commitment to standing up and writing hard for Palestine. So I want to start with a really heartfelt thanks for Dania. To Dania and all of the So now on to today's panel. So today's panel focuses on repression of pro-Palestinian dissent across various sectors in Toronto. Of course, this repression and its roots, anti-Palestinian racism, is not new. But over the past year, there has been a noticeable increase in attempts to silence pro-Palestinian voices, both here in Toronto and across North America and Europe. This repression has manifested through various channels, including government policies, media narrative, surveillance and policing, various forms of censorship, and institutional crackdowns, often featuring a range of creative new definitions of anti-Semitism, community safety, and even DEI, aimed at stifling critique and dissent while gaslighting the simultaneous surge in anti-Palestinian racism across various sectors. This panel is intended to look at how various forms of repression have taken place here in Toronto and their impact on various sectors: the university and academic life, the arts, labor, and activism. From the onset, it's worth noting that this repression is also a reaction to an unprecedented level of critical public discourse, mobilization, and activism across these various sectors in opposition to Israeli apartheid and genocide. As I was biking here today, I was thinking about how it is literally hard to go through a full city block in Toronto these days without seeing visible signs of solidarity with Palestine. Keffiyehs, flags, posters, lawn signs, a necklace, a bracelet. Palestine is everywhere, and the call for its liberation is continuing to grow globally. We've put together an amazing panel of local Toronto folks today who've been part of these mobilizations across the various sectors. And the goal is to both discuss the various forms of repression folks have been facing and strategize about how we can continue to mobilize and keep up the momentum for a long-haul protest that can be sustained week after week and month after month. This orientation towards sustained disruptive mobilization and protest across various sectors is, I think, the only way forward. And it requires that we make sure that the people who face the full force of state suppression, the students, the scholars, the artists, the activists, and the workers, also have the full force of community support. This is why the initiatives like the Toronto Community Justice Fund, which you'll hear about later today, are so critical to this work. It's the only way to make these movements sustainable. It's also why we have some incredible community lawyers who will be part of the conversation today. I'm going to introduce the speakers one at a time. Each will speak for about 10 minutes to outline what some of the key mobilization moments have been in the city, or other themes, as the case may be. And then after that, we'll have a group conversation and then open it up to the questions from the audience. So starting with, to my right, Esmat Al-Halabi, who is an assistant professor of transnational history. He works principally on the intellectual history of West and South Asia. Esmat also sits on the steering committee of Hearing Palestine Initiative at the University of Toronto, which supports academic freedom on campus and challenges the university's institutionalized anti-Palestinian racism.
Thank you, Leila, and thank you, Dania. And sorry, Leila, for not sticking to the assignment to the T. And also, Leila is going to cut me off at 10 minutes in case I go too long. Again, As Leila mentioned, I am an academic, and so if you'll permit me, I'm just going to read. So I'm not really an expert on the local situation beyond my own experience of it, which is both predictable and unremarkable. So while I'm happy to discuss specific instances of repression later, especially at the University of Toronto, where I teach, I'd like to first offer general points about Palestinian liberation and Zionist ideology in the contemporary North American university and in North American academic culture generally. I want to do this in part to clarify what kind of institution the university is and the peculiar challenges to confronting it, which are both material, even infrastructural, and fundamentally epistemological. We're dealing with a way of knowing, patterns of thinking within which Palestine does not exist. When we talk about Palestinian freedom, or simply Palestinian life and history, we face a wall of denial, as Edward Said once put it, and no rehearsal of the daily scandals, the cascade of censorship, or even the number of corpses can adequately account for the situation we're in. Israeli university administrators are frontline warriors in the battle for Israel and in the academy of its imperial benefactors, even before students decisively turned to encampments as their organizational tactic last spring. Just days into this latest war on Gaza, in the second week of October, leaders of Hebrew University dispatched open letters to their counterparts at Stanford and Harvard. The letters endorsed Israel's invasion of Gaza as, quote, a preventive measure, and rebuked their American counterparts for failing moral standards and not forcefully standing with Israel. By November 1st, the Israeli Association of University Heads had issued a statement to colleagues around the world, as they put it, although for obvious reasons only, quote, Western academic institutions and, quote, halls of enlightenment in America and Europe are mentioned. In it, they argued that support for Israel was in effect, quote, solidarity with humanity, enlightenment, and progress, unquote. So, immediately for Israeli academics, and soon thereafter for their Western Zionist counterparts, the crafted narrative was clear. Western universities were in crisis, and mass student support for Palestinian liberation served as its paradigmatic manifestation. The battle over Zionism was the battle over the soul of the Western University itself. What is the Western University? In so many words, an enemy of humanity. And if I get cut off, just remember that. As America's empire waxed violently across the globe, the student movements of the 1960s understood the demands that they were making of their universities were materially linked to visions for a radically new world order, that is to say, decolonization, national liberation, and anti-colonialism worldwide. Students demanded a new university that would be accountable not only to the communities on its campus, but to those outside its walls. Students linked their institutional demands on admissions, hiring, curriculum, that sort of thing, with their university's active participation in racialized policing at home and imperialist war abroad, so to speak. Against the democratic and anti-imperialist vision of these alliances and movements, the contemporary university reconstituted itself. The demands of the student movements of the 1960s and 70s were met with a fierce offensive, not only by the university, but by powerful economic and political entities. These forces made opposite demands to those of the students, that the university reinforce the systems of power that would keep these precise communities out of the campus and subdue its own community within its walls. The purported crisis of the university can therefore be understood as the problem of adapting the university to the new kinds of publics and demands for social justice brought to the university through these student movements. Sorry, there's a long sentence, I realize. The university repurposed these student demands by claiming the discourse of diversity and identity politics and positioning the administration and the state as its protectors against the very students mobilizing for social justice. The categories of civil rights were co-opted, with university bureaucracy operating as a response to, rather than a result of, student demands. Alongside wielding a growing administrative labyrinth, Security forces were institutionalized across campuses, their legal authorities formalized, and personnel training designed to resemble that of municipal police. Haunted by donors and crying austerity, today's universities are run, at bottom, by shadowy, undemocratic bodies of political appointees and business people, known alternatively as trustees, regents, or governors. At the granular level, an army of administrators, from anonymous HR personnel to DEI agents, manage the demands of faculty and students at the behest of a rotating ensemble of deans and provosts and vice deans and vice provosts. The structures built through this reconstitution were ready to respond to the current student uprising and were immediately wielded against, for example, the encampments of last spring-summer. Students protesting genocide faced violent police raids, harassment, and doxing, and punitive severing of access to university resources, as did faculty. They also found themselves ensnared in the administrative web of DEI, paradoxically accused of discrimination and making their peers feel unsafe, quote unquote. The student mobilization and the administrative response have exposed, I think, both the Zionist project and the Western University as entangled in imperial formations. Both have lost mass legitimacy, and both have shown themselves as necessitating violence for their reproduction. The students have laid bare the ideological and material apparatus by which these projects are sustained, as well as the beginning of their unraveling. Now, it's important to remember that students have not mobilized, students, faculty, everybody on university campuses have not mobilized simply because they've heeded the call of Palestinians, which they have, but because Israel itself has placed their universities in its sights. If Palestinian universities exist today at the will of an Israeli state ready and willing to eliminate their campuses, and Palestinian academics within and without the proverbial green line are subject to censure, arrest, abuse, and premature death, universities beyond Israel's sovereign power are the targets of coordinated rhetorical attack. The outsized emphasis on Western universities in the Israeli and Zionist imagination is a consequence both of a shared intellectual inheritance and deep material coordination. The fulminations of Israelis and their supporters in the United States arrived ready-made in the heads of American politicians already hostile to higher education for their own related reasons. By December 2023, the presidents of elite American universities were being interrogated for purportedly fostering anti-Semitism on their respective campuses. From the river to the sea was transformed into a call for genocide, and decolonization was declared code for annihilation. Condemnations of Palestinian political expression were constructed alongside defenses of Israeli institutions, which were conveniently cast as great bastions of liberal freedom, the appropriate bodies to represent Israel's righteous, civilized war. Ron Robin, the president of the University of Haifa, embarked on a goodwill mission in November of 2023, capitalizing on the existing social and institutional affiliations between Israeli universities and its Western allies. And I should note, many, if not all, the Israeli university presidents studied at mostly American universities, not to mention Israeli politicians, Netanyahu on down. Fresh from his meetings with the San Diego, University of California, San Diego's campus chancellor, Robin proclaimed, quote, that the university should never be a site for advocacy. This is Robin. It's a cloister, it's a sort of monastery, where people are deeply involved in falsifiable theories about ideas and ethics. If something's not falsifiable, it probably has to do with advocacy, and not with scholarship, unquote. By April, Israeli university presidents were encouraging North American university presidents to sic the police on their students protesting the genocide committed by their state and with their institutional support. And this is what they wrote in their letter in April to the Association of Israeli University Presidents. Quote, "We understand the complexity and challenges involved in managing insightful and hateful groups, recognizing that extreme situations may require measures beyond the conventional tools available to university administrators." Beyond the formal propaganda role of Israeli university administrators, to say nothing of their professional roles as the executives of major state institutions, we may examine the utterances of the Zionist intelligentsia. While the hostile mainstream media apparatus has predictably served its decades-old mendacious role, New York Times, and a small number of small magazines have sought to puncture the wall of complicity, XYZ, let me cut to the chase here. The line between Hasbara and independent journalism is so thin as to be non-existent. The composition of editorial boards and shared sources of funding, to say nothing of terminological and ideological similitude, speaks to a network of intellectual production committed to misrepresenting criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism, the boycott of Israeli institutions as illiberal, and the activity of students and teachers on university campuses as the wellspring of Islamo-wokeism worldwide. The content of these ideas is not separate from the material collaborations between Zionist institutions on both sides of the Atlantic. American and Zionist scholars are joined by their Israeli counterparts, some funded and placed in US universities and colleges in temporary positions under the auspices of something called the Israel Institute, where they are mandated to teach 3 courses a year on modern Israel. To be clear, that is what's going on here is Israeli academics are being paid to teach in North American universities by groups like the Israel Institute, not by these universities. Universities just get free labor, which they're eager to get. I'll skip some more of that. And here. Okay, 1 paragraph. So, all of this material collaboration, there is a form of knowledge that arrives at the end of it, and that is often something called Israel Studies. So what is Israel Studies? The pretense of academic rigor, the cloak of complexity, and the existence of some serious work produced under its rubric does not controvert the fact that Israel Studies is fundamentally attached to the ideological project of the Israeli state and its proliferation in North American universities conditioned by Zionist philanthropy. There are over 20 centers for Israel Studies in North America and some 27 additional faculty chairs, nearly all of which were founded or are sustained by private foundations. The politics of the field reflect these commitments. The Jewish Review of Books, a periodical supported by the same Tikva fund that floats Tablet magazine, all bad sources of information which you may have seen, published a revealing symposium in the winter of 2024 featuring Itamar Rabinovich, Michael Walzer, Anita Shapira, Arya Sapoznik, and others. Shapira, the doyen of Israel Studies, articulated the liberal Zionist consensus du jour. Quote, "It's clear to me that we have to separate from the Palestinians. The idea of partition was always the right idea. A border is something that must always be guarded," unquote. In his postscript to the first issue of Israel Studies, published during the war on Gaza, Sapoznik catastrophizes with the standard locutions of an American culture warrior. He evokes crises of acute threats posed to liberal democracy, which stretch from Israel and the world, which is promoted by the post-truth culture of the left, and so on and so forth. He says all this. He proceeds to indict the critical academic study of Israel and Zionism, especially settler colonial studies, for purportedly nurturing this culture. Sapoznik's a big name. In the end, he says, he rehashes Israel Studies' disciplinary denialism. Human and its derivatives, especially the humanities, are repeated dozens of times in his 20-page Jeremiah. He uncritically embraces the Enlightenment's understanding of humanity itself and seeks to reclaim our enlightened heritage. This is his quote. The human, I would argue in Sapoznik's empty refrain, is what Sylvia Wynter has referred to as man, that genre of human consecrated in the European imperial furnace. And Sapoznik's humanity is bereft of Palestinians. Israel Studies' approach to the history of Israel shares them with the Heritage Foundation's approach to American history: denial, defensiveness, and paranoia. Israeli colonialism is represented essentially as a conspiracy, historically and analytically at odds with, in his words, methodological rigor, honesty, and humanistic ethics, unquote. The crisis of Zionist legitimacy is therefore transformed into a crisis of humanity itself, as indeed it may very well be. Thank you, and sorry.
U.S. Met for proving can't take academics anywhere. But I look forward to reading the paper version of this also. Next up, we have Louis Jacob, who's an artist with an international reputation. He was a member of the Board of Trustees at the Art Gallery of Ontario from 2009 to 2014. He also served at the AGO's Indigenous and Canadian Curatorial Committee from 2015 to 2024. Since December 2023, he has been involved with the group Toronto Artists Coalition for Palestine.
Thank you, Leila, and it's good to see everyone here. Just hearing you speak, I was reminded of a similar panel that I attended several months ago, and one of the panelists observed that here in Toronto, the attacks have been centered on three sectors: education, so universities primarily, culture, so art galleries and museums, and health, hospitals. And I find it very interesting to think of what is it about those sectors that have become the targets here in Toronto. So I work as an artist, I teach at University of Toronto, I do lots of things, but I'm here to talk about my participation in the Art Gallery of Ontario and what's been happening there lately as a kind of case study. It's not unique. I mean, these attacks are happening at the level of individuals, at the level of like small artist-run centers, at the level of large galleries. But I'll just say a few anecdotal things to kind of convey this one kind of case study. So, as Leila mentioned, I've been involved at the Art Gallery of Ontario on the board for 5 years, and then later joined what was then the Department of Canadian Art. And I was there for 9 years at the Committee for Canadian Art. Something very interesting happened maybe 3 years into my participation in that committee. The Department of Canadian Art got renamed. It now became called the J.S. McLean Center for Indigenous and Canadian Art. And I think it's important to think of what a huge shift that is. That's not just a shift in a title or in a name, it's a very important shift in ideology. You can imagine all the work behind the scenes that had to happen for that to take place. I'm going to read from a publication that was published to show these new initiatives of this new department. Our new model, the two curators, so Wanda Nanabush is the Indigenous Canadian, the curator of Indigenous art in this department, and Georgiana Uliarek, who's the curator of Canadian art. They are colleagues who work together to put this new vision together. And they wrote, our new model was based on the nation-to-nation treaties between specific First Nations in Britain that served as a foundation of Canada. The shift is reflected in the new name, J.S. McLean Center for Indigenous and Canadian Art, with the intentional leading placement of Indigenous. To acknowledge the history of broken treaties and long-standing exclusion of Indigenous voices from art museums, our department has privileged Indigenous art as a starting point for the reinstallation of the permanent collection. So the takeaway that I have for that is this idea that the model of the department is one based on treaty relationships, which are based on a nation-to-nation agreements. So the implication there is that Indigenous art and culture is not a subsection of Canadian art. It's its own thing in relation to which Canadian art has its relation. So it's a very radical gesture, extremely important and to reflect the reality of this location, but also I think in museum practice internationally, I think it's very innovative. If you're interested, they published this book titled Moving the Museum, Indigenous and Canadian Art at the AGO. I think the choice of cover image is quite amazing. It's a photograph by the artist Jeff Thomas, of someone with a scene from behind. It turns out to be the photographer's son, and the shirt that he's wearing says "Little White Lies." So I think in the context of what's happened since this publication was published, this has taken on added meanings. But my point is to say that for many years, very recently, the AGO has kind of undergone a really important shift in how it understands its place as a colonial institution. And Wanda Andebush in particular, this curator of indigenous art, was doing incredible work. I mean, really difficult but extremely important work, like doing major retrospectives of very important figures like Rita Latondra, Robert Kuhl, publishing monographs, often the first like single major catalog on their work of these senior artists, collecting work by indigenous, but also like Canadian artists of colors and minority artists, including it in the permanent collection of the AGO. So vast work. Also well celebrated for her work. I mean, the institution was very happy that she's doing all of this. They're getting a lot of kind of glow and from her initiatives. She started an annual global indigenous conference called ABAQUAD that happens every year, but it takes place in Toronto one year, then in another city around the world in another location that year, then back in Toronto. She did this all on her own initiative and fundraising. So the institution itself was getting was very happy to benefit from her labor. This book that documents those initiatives was recently published just at the end of last year. It won like an Ontario kind of Art Galleries Award. And just literally a week or 2 weeks after the announcement of this award, I, as a member of this committee, received an email announcing that Wanda has departed. Inexplicably. The email just kind of used this euphemism, she's departed, offered no explanation. But instantly, of course, I had to worry of what's behind the scenes. Now, of course, she wasn't able to talk about it. So one of these kind of gaslighting strategies is to force people who are subject to violence to sign NDA, non-disclosure agreement. And so she was unable to speak about it. And so there was this kind of cloud of confusion over the whole community and the committee itself, like, this doesn't make any sense, but no one can talk about it. Fortunately, in our community, 4 days after this announcement, an email was leaked on social media, which clarified the situation. So a group that called itself Israel Museums Canada, it turns out had written a letter in October last year addressed to the director of the AGO, attacking Wanda. It was a pure character, personality smear. And this helps to explain her departure. Now, this email was leaked, so it was never supposed to have appeared in the public realm. So this kind of cloud of confusion was just supposed to hover and then back to business as usual, right? Like people can't attach it to anything. But this leaked message changed the discourse substantially. And it facilitated, I think, people to speak up in the arts community of attacks that they themselves have experienced, but which were also kind of clouded in a veil of silence. I had been told 3 years ago that I was in a blacklist. Now, when I was told this, I couldn't make any sense of it. It just sounded like very surreal to me. In retrospect, now I can understand that these kinds of attacks have been happening not just since October or November last year, but for several years. I've talked to people and artists from centers and film festivals, and they've gotten under similar attacks 3 years ago. There's been now a refreshed round of attacks now, attacking primarily their sources of funding and even their landlords. So trying to get their leases for their spaces destroyed so that they become homeless institutions. Maybe I'll end it here, but just to allow for more discussion. But one thing I'd like to add is it's been amazing to see In the face of these attacks, artists and artist-run centers come together in these coalitions of artists for Palestine. These initiatives are very spontaneous. They're all volunteer, but it's been amazing to see. So I've joined this group since December, a group of visual artists, but there's similarly a group of filmmakers, a group of writers, groups of artist-run centers, and others doing many, many important initiatives. Putting together alternative film festivals in relation to the Hot Dogs Festival, for example, information campaigns, information gathering, like fact gathering. So really amazing kind of consolidation of response to these attacks. So thanks everyone. I hope more of these kind of stories can come out and we can see what shared strategies are available to us. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. And just to add a quick note that for those of you who don't know, probably most of you do know, the source of the attack on Wanda were primarily her social media feed and her postings about the situation in Gaza. She's been speaking about Palestine for many years, but specifically after October 7th, and she's continued to stay very vocal on her social media feed, so do follow her if you're not already. Okay, next we have Jackie Esmond, who's a social justice lawyer and who's been representing workers facing anti-Palestinian racism in the workplace, as well as one of the lead lawyers representing University of Toronto students in the encampment injunction case. Jackie has over 20 years of experience in public interest litigation, including supporting Indigenous land defense, employment and labor rights, and pay equity. Woohoo!
Thanks so much. So I've been asked to talk about the wave of repression that people are facing in the workplace. I work in a law firm that specializes in labor and employment law, and it's no exaggeration to say that for months, beginning in October, our law firm was flooded with cases of individual workers and students who were facing investigations, discipline, firing, relating primarily to social media activity, relating to commentary on the war and on Palestine. And it was so intense that we had to pull together basically an informal team. We had 8 to 9 lawyers who were kind of on standby to respond to the many inquiries we got. I would estimate we were getting 5 to 7 calls a week from people who were facing work or school-related reprisals. It's slowed down a little bit, not a lot. And it's just something that I had never seen before. The scale, I mean, certainly reprisals for pro-Palestinian speech is not new, but the scale of the reprisal that we've seen is shocking, and I'm not sure that it's well understood how deep it goes. So as I said, for the most part, what I've seen is reprisals based to people speaking online. And so what happens is somebody will be active online, there will be a complaint to the employer, it may be a campaign of complaints to an employer, and so that's kind of how it comes to the attention in the workplace generally. And so just to give you one example, and there's many, but and I'm going to anonymize all of the examples that I speak about unless it's somebody who's been named in the media. But there was a complaint was made, but it was by a coworker in this case, about a healthcare worker. The healthcare worker had reposted on Instagram. It was she had reposted a post by quite a famous Palestinian poet who commented and referred to genocide in Gaza. And so there was a complaint about this particular post that was said to be anti-Semitic and discriminatory. The employer called her in. She was immediately placed on a leave so that an investigation could take place. And you may have seen, this was reported in the media, one institution in particular, Hospital for Sick Kids, has a policy that if there is a complaint relating to Palestine, then the worker is immediately placed on a leave until an investigation takes place. So you can imagine the chilling effect that that has. So in this case, the investigation took place, took a month, 6 weeks, I can't remember, but ultimately this was interesting. The employer found the post was not discriminatory, but the employer said it was unprofessional. It violated the code of conduct. And I'll quote from the letter, the employer said, "We have an obligation to ensure that all patients' families feel safe to receive care. The current conflict in Israel-Gaza has demonstrated that this is an incredibly delicate balance. Sometimes it will require those of us who care for patients to say less on polarizing issues, especially when facts are not fully ascertained." And during the meeting with HR that this worker had, the HR representative went even further and said, if you make future posts that are not neutral about the war, you will be disciplined. And I raise this example because the employer didn't take action because they found it was discriminatory, but because it was less than that. It was unprofessional. And the employer's position was that any non-neutral social media communication, so communication made outside of work, you're off duty, would violate the code of conduct relating to professionalism and could result in discipline. So it's an example of what we've seen quite frequently, which is what we call the weaponization of professionalism as a way to silence speech about Palestine. And certainly the healthcare sector was mentioned. We've seen a lot of reprisals in the healthcare sector. And so one of the first questions I get when I tell stories like this, or when someone comes into the office for a consultation, they'll say, well, how can the employer do this? I posted a line off duty. I wasn't at work. Why is it any of their business? And unfortunately, that doesn't matter. I have to tell them. There is case law, there is a basis in law for an employer to say your off-duty conduct can engage the workplace if it, for example, could harm the company's reputation, if it could lead to a poisoned workplace or a refusal by your coworkers to work with you. Then employers in law can say, well, that's my business, and I can do something about it. I can discipline you, I can fire you. And of course, you don't give up your right to free speech when you take a job. There has to be a balance there, but you look at your own policies in your workplace. Most employers have codes of conduct that prohibit conduct that is discriminatory or that causes a poisoned workplace. So what we find in these cases is that's where the real battle is when we're trying to fight back against reprisal in the workplace, is really pushing back hard on this idea that criticizing Israel, pro-Palestinian speech is anti-Semitic. That's the battleground that we're fighting on. And it means naming anti-Palestinian racism. And I thank Dania in my mind every single day for the report on anti-Palestinian racism that was published by our Canadian Lawyers Association. It has been an incredible piece of work that we can rely on in these cases. There are other things that we can use now too. So this is not intended to be a doom and gloom speech, right? Because there is a lot of things that are making me feel a lot better about what's happening despite the repression. We have, for example, this isn't an employment-related example, but the backlash against the law students at TMU for signing the open letter. There was an investigation that cleared them and said that that wasn't anti-Semitic, that this conflation of support for Palestinian liberation with the destruction of Israel is actually incredibly harmful So we see reports like the TMU report pushing back and saying no. And we can use that. We can use that in the work that we're doing. In the U of T injunction case, U of T worked so hard on those students in the encampment, made incredibly horrible allegations about hate speech and violence and anti-Semitism taking place at the encampment. And the court said no. That characterization is wrong. What they're doing is not anti-Semitic. And it may seem obvious, it's obvious to those of us here, but it's so important that these institutions are saying that, and we can use it to continue the fight back. If you're facing anti-Palestinian racism in the workplace, then there are these resources, there are these things we can use now to fight back. I'll give you one other example. Again, it's another healthcare worker who was facing an investigation arising from a media interview that she did in which she criticized Israel for bombing a hospital in Gaza, which one should be able to do. She was placed on leave while the investigation took place. That took 6 weeks. She's not at work. We had to marshal evidence from international human rights and medical organizations to defend her statements. We had to point to international law that prohibits targeting health facilities in war. We had to establish this health professional had her own personal direct knowledge of what was happening on the ground at this hospital in Gaza in order to convince her employer that what she said was accurate and defensible. So it takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of work. We were successful. They eventually accepted that she had done nothing wrong. She was cleared, she was brought back to work. But it takes an enormous toll. So I would say, for the most part, when folks are suspended, students, workers, if we can get in there early and fight back, we're successful. People are, you're winning. But it takes an incredible toll on the person, on their family, on the people around them, on their coworkers who see their reprisal. And I want to raise one other example too that really has affected, I don't know why this one hits me so hard. But it's not even sometimes talking about the war in Gaza. Sometimes it's just being Muslim online is enough. So I'm aware of one case where, again, a healthcare worker in and around October 7th posted a Muslim prayer online. She was suspended and fired eventually from her job for something as little as that. So the reprisal is deep and wide and is certainly steeped in Islamophobia as well as anti-Palestinian racism. And so the last thing I want to say in my last minute is I want to say how incredibly important the public campaigns have been in the fight back for defending students and defending workers. Many of you may be familiar, this case got a lot of press, the case of Dr. Yipeng Ji, who was a medical resident in Ottawa. He was suspended last November when he posted on Instagram a photo of a placard that had that slogan, "From the river to the sea," and another placard that spoke about Israel's genocidal policy. And there was a campaign launched to defend him. There were tens of thousands, over 80,000 signatures on a petition defending him. There was a letter campaign. The hospital and the university were flooded with letters of support from all sectors: health, academics, patients, community members. And Dr. G was out there publicly. He didn't apologize. He didn't walk back his post. He defended what he said. And I'm very happy to say that the suspension was lifted. He was welcomed back to work. And that is also incredibly important for people to see. Not just that there is this wave of repression that's silencing, but that when you continue to speak, and when we continue to speak together and support one another through these campaigns, that is an incredibly important message that is really the last thing that I wanted to end on, is that we need to be able to defend people We need to be able to have the organization to speak publicly. I acknowledge it's not for everyone to be public about it because there's so much risk that comes with that too. But the more that we have these wins publicly, the more the tide is going to turn. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And I want to reiterate, for every case like Dr. Yiga we do know about, there's tens and if not hundreds of cases that we don't know about, and we are so appreciative of all the work that you're doing for all the ones that we don't know about. So thank you. Okay, and last but not least, we have Arash Qiyasi, who's a criminal defense lawyer who has been representing numerous protesters facing criminal charges stemming from their activism. Arash is dedicated to practicing criminal law defense with an anti-oppression lens, understanding the legal system can be a place of great injustice. He has also worked at well-regarded civil liberties organizations on both sides of the US-Canada border.
Thank you so much, Leila. Thank you, Dania. It's an honor to be here. As Leila mentioned, I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and for the last several years, I've also been a member of the Movement Defense Committee, which is an organization that coordinates legal support for protesters when their protest gets them into trouble with the law. And so here's what we're seeing in the last year in terms of the police's response. As we all know, the Canadian state is complicit in Israel's genocide in Palestine. At home, this means that the state is heavily repressing protests against Israel on a scale that a lot of us haven't seen before. To give you a sense of that, since last October, we are aware in Toronto alone of almost 100 cases of people who have been arrested and charged in relation to Palestine solidarity activism. This repression is Canada-wide, and it is coordinated between all police departments and all levels of government. But just to focus on Toronto, which has been a hub of protest activity, it is alarming, for example, to see that the hate crime unit of the Toronto Police Service has been expanded. It has been given a lot of new resources, and also its mandate has been changed. So now it is responsible for investigating all protests in relation to the Middle East, even when there is no criminal complaint with respect to that protest. So what the police in this unit are doing is they're monitoring all of our protests, and they are filtering all of that through this framework that intentionally misrepresents our legitimate political expression as an expression of anti-Semitism. This is very ironic for a police force that we know is a racist institution. The Toronto Police Service has themselves admitted that they use disproportionate force against Black people, Indigenous people, Middle Eastern people, and all people of color. And now their anti-Palestinian racism means that they use disproportionate force against our protests. And the weaponization of the hate crimes unit is especially problematic because only the title of that unit, the hate crimes unit, already and automatically brands anyone that they're investigating as a hate criminal, which is extremely stigmatizing and has severe ramifications, including for their employment, even when the police themselves are not saying that they have committed a hate crime. And in fact, there have been very few instances where protesters have been accused of actual hate crimes. I know of one case where someone was accused of publicly inciting hatred for waving the flag of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The police chief, the Toronto police chief at the time, announced this with great fanfare, only for the case to be dropped shortly thereafter because it is not actually illegal to do that. So we're not seeing a lot of actual hate crimes being alleged, specifically at protests, but we are seeing other charges where police are sometimes claiming in news releases or heavily implying that people who committed these non-hate crimes nevertheless were motivated by hate, which is something that if a court agrees with would give them a higher sentence. So what are the charges that we are seeing? The charges that we are seeing are, for the most part, similar to charges that we've always seen leveled against protesters over the years. We're just seeing a lot more of them. The most common charges we see are, one classic example is when the police escalate a situation and instigate a confrontation with protesters. Protesters react or respond in some way, and then they are arrested and charged with assaulting a peace officer. That's a classic. And the other one that we see very often is mischief. Mischief is a criminal offense which is about damaging or interfering with the use of property. And the state is interpreting this offense very broadly. So we see a lot, for example, of a lot of cases where people's artistic expression, for example, with paint, is being criminalized in this way. And in one case, even the use of ketchup. And so that's a case I want to talk to you about a little bit. One of my clients is a well-known physician and humanitarian, Dr. Tariq Lubani. Police say that late last October, as part of a protest in the city of London, he went to the constituency office of Liberal Member of Parliament, Peter Fragiskatos, who at the time had refused to call for a ceasefire. And police say that Dr. Lubani put some ketchup on the outside walls of the MP office to mark the blood of Palestinians. And I kid you not, Dr. Lubani is going to be put on trial over this ketchup because police say this is mischief. The Crown Prosecutor's office thinks it is a useful use of our public resources, our tax dollars, to have a 5-day trial in March, plus 3 days of pretrial proceedings in January and February for some ketchup. We don't see this happen in any other context. And that's despite the fact that our courts are backed up and don't have the time or capacity to deal with serious offenses and serious harm. But we are fighting back, and one of the things that we want the court to recognize at trial is that this provision of the criminal code, mischief, should not be misused to criminalize this kind of expression that really causes no damage. Now, I've mentioned the London Crown Attorney's Office, but I want to say a few more words about the Crown's Office in general. And for those who may not be familiar with the term, the Crown's Office is Canada's equivalent to the DA's office. It is the office of all the lawyers who prosecute all the crimes. And they're called the Crown because, well, they represent Charlie, our head of state. So I want to give a shout out to Martin Lukash, a journalist with The Breach. Thanks for his journalism. We now know that there is a secretive team within Ontario's Crown Attorney's Office that is again called the Hate Crimes Working Group. And this group oversees all cases related to Palestine. It's a group that includes some people with very close ties to Israel, and they have been contacting local Crown attorneys across the province to give them input on how they should be handling these cases. Now, I don't know exactly what this group is telling the local Crown attorneys because that's a government secret. But we have seen that local Crown attorneys have been taking a more hardline approach to these cases. There have been cases where local Crown attorneys have been offering to drop the charges or to offer a very favorable resolution, only to then come back and say, sorry, it's off the table. These cases have also generally been moving very slowly through the courts. That's partially because our court system is always slow and broken in different ways. But in some cases, I believe it's intentional because the Crown wants these charges to hang over people's heads so that they're more limited in going back to protest. Now, having said all of that, it is also beautiful to see the solidarity that exists in our communities in the face of this repression. We haven't seen people slow down on protests. What we have seen is people come together to support each other. And one of the ways that's happened is through the Toronto Community Justice Fund, something that we're going to hear about a little bit more later on today. But what's important to remember is that having charges can be scary, can be difficult, and it can, as Jackie said, be a process that is itself hard to get through. But when we organize together, we're stronger than the state. They can't silence all of us, and as long as we have each other's backs, even those of us who have charges will be able to deal with them and rejoin the movement.